Hello and welcome to this week's bonus episode of Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. This week I spoke with Sally Gurner about oligarchic dysfunction, i.e. oligarchic capitalism and late-stage capitalism and the situation that we're in today. Sally says that the fall of every civilization begins with an oligarchic ruling class, and thus she expects that we can expect collapse to follow, because too many resources have been pooled by too few people. And apparently this is what happens every time before a civilization cycles into decay. Good news. The very good news about being in this one as opposed to, I don't know, the end of the Roman Empire or the Aztecs or any other civilization would be that we have a huge amount of information at our fingertips. We have networks of people around the world who are connecting and communicating about these problems. And many countries are now fortunate enough to be living in democracies, which means that although two-party systems are far from perfect, generally speaking, citizens do have some level of choice in comparison to the citizens that were living in all of those other civilizations before us. Whether or not voting citizens in democratic countries are nothing more than consumers under capitalism is another argument, and one that I make on quite a few episodes and these bonus episodes. But that's not what I want to touch on today. What I want to talk more about is this revelation that Sally gives about halfway through the episode, in which she says that change always comes from the people just underneath the powerful. So the middle men, not necessarily middle class. She says that everyone who believes, the change is going to be ground up, simply hasn't studied the history enough to see that change comes from the class or the group just below the powerful. I'm not a history buff, but the first thing I did think of was the French Revolution, both the most recent ones, in which certainly 1968, it was the students. So it was arguably upper and middle class people with access to education that decided to overthrow or overturn a system that was stacked in their favor. The USA's War of Independence was not a peasant revolt. Somebody can correct me on this, but it seems that a lot of people who would have been chanting off with their heads in the past would also have been keeping court with the heads that were rolling then through the streets. So what does this mean for us in this situation? I find it very empowering. I find it very empowering to think that it's not the 1% that has to change, but maybe the 30% below them, that it is possible to grab at power. It is possible to disempower an elite class. It's possible to take over means of production. Essentially, if those below the elites have the vision to, and I don't really like using the term elites, but if those below the decision makers currently and are willing to perhaps sacrifice their own proxy to greatness or achievement, then we could forge a better way for everybody. This is such an interesting argument if you think about it, because so often when we speak about the changes that need to be made today, we discuss, well, how do you get to the people that really need to make the changes? How do you get to the billionaires? And how do you get to the corporate leaders? And how do you get to the heads of the banks? And how do you get to the heads of government? How do you make them see that they really, really need to change? Well, the strategy should be getting to the people below them, according to Sally. And that seems to be much more plausible and genuinely hold potential. I think we're perhaps seeing this with Gen Z. I don't think my millennial generation rejected the structures of society as much as the generation after us. We were kind of the mental health generation, still with the promise of a good career and whatever. And Gen Z have been weaned on the reality that the world is not theirs for the taking. And there's a creationism in their rejection of all that is modern and all that is capitalist. If we had another couple of decades, I would say that they'd probably be the generation that would have really genuinely changed the world for the better once they moved into the positions of power. As it is, the problem is not generational, and we are running out of time, and the boomers are taking up a hell of a lot of space. It actually makes me think of Jason Hickel's point about the fact that the environmental movement needs to join forces with the labour movement or risk irrelevancy. He says, environmentalism plus labour, you win. Arguably, the trade unions could be identified as the group below the decision makers. They have a lot of power, they pack a lot of punch, and they have access to decision makers and they can sway decisions. And I think certainly imagine the movement of labour plus environmentalism. That is essentially your working and middle classes joining forces rather than being atomized by political division. At which point, this might be idealistic, but it does seem like an almost unstoppable force. And again, I am not a history buff, but if anybody has any examples of that happening, or having happened, I would really love to know. Please leave it in the comments below. Also, side note, apparently the environmentalist and labour movements are joining forces in Switzerland. So if anybody's Swiss, if anybody has access to anyone involved in either of those movements, I would actually love to get them on the show to discuss that. So please comment below. Perhaps unions could push through the 4-day work week that degrowth scholars suggest to lower emissions. Perhaps mass strike action on the part of civilians could force the hands of corporations to stop a dependency on fossil fuels or as much fossil fuels. It really does depend on the middle and working classes coming together because of the state precarity, certainly in nations like the United Kingdom and the United States. For strike action to work, everybody has to be willing to do it. And yet the whole premise of precarity as a political function to control citizens is that if you decide to stick up for yourself, to demand better conditions, essentially somebody else is so squeezed and in such a worse off position that they will happily fill your position should you choose to strike and leave. That's why socialist states like France see much better responses to their strike action. It's not just the fact that they're organized and angry. It's the fact that they have a welfare state that they can depend on. So the government knows fine well, if they say they're going to strike for 6 months, they can afford to. And so corporations know that if the workers say they're going to strike for 6 months, they can afford to because the state financially will look after them. In Western nations, given the access that we all have to education, perhaps we are all the middle group. Perhaps we all have access to power and decision makers that previously we didn't. I personally found that hearing I don't have to be in the boardroom, I can be in the corridor where decisions are made and still be a change maker and still be part of the group that forces the hands of the powerful or forces a change in society. I found that incredibly empowering, and I think it's a message that needs to be broadcasted. The state of disempowerment in social movements is hobbling a lot of their progress. I think in the environmentalist movement, it's the sheer devastation that most people wake up with the knowledge that, you know, the world is really in danger. And I think, again, a lot of people with knowledge then feel culpable in some sense, which only drives or feeds a certain disempowerment. People either react with anger or sort of self-victimization, right? Because it's almost too difficult to cognitively process just how responsible we are for the devastation of our own people and biodiversity and the climate. So I think refocusing the conversation to tell people you can change, and not just your individual behavior, but you can actually change the behaviors and the decisions of the people above you, of those that you perceive to have power, of those that you perceive to have trapped the world into this headlong rush into destruction. I think that's key. People cannot act unless they feel empowered to, or unless their back's up against a wall. And climate change, it is just not a tangible enough experience yet for us to make the changes necessary, for us to have that survival instinct kick in and make the changes necessary. Once the effects are tangible, those changes will be too late. So ultimately, it's time to dethrone the oligarchs. Thank you everyone for tuning in. If there's somebody that you want me to get on the show, or if there's some way that you think I can improve, please leave it in the comments below. I will see it. I will respond. Remember to subscribe if you're new here. And if you're a long-time listener and you're really enjoying the show, support Planet Critical on Patreon. The link is in the description box below. To everyone who is supporting the podcast, thank you. This work wouldn't be possible without you. And it's just amazing to see a Planet Critical community spring up around the world. Okay, everyone, thank you for watching. I hope this was valuable in some way, or at least thought-provoking. And I will see you next week.